Okay, so first things first, no, again, thank you, JJ, and thank you to the Cine law firm for having this kind of weekly um, opportunities or discussions on privacy or data protection. It's very, very important simply because unlike in other parts of the world, like Europe, for example, privacy is an evolution as opposed to us, it's really more of a revolution, right? Or like we talk about running, for them, it has been a marathon. For us, it's really more of a sprint. Well, that being said, let me proceed with my presentation on the privacy in the pandemic, lessons learned from the BPO industry, and hopefully I can be able to impart knowledge that you can use, practical knowledge that you can use regardless of the industry where you belong, right? Whether you're a lawyer, IT person, HR person, compliance. So I hope that after this presentation, you'll be equipped with some tips that you can really, really use, right? When you go back to your regular work. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, so I'd like to start first with key concepts on data privacy. So because it's very important for us to some kind of leveling off so that when we talk about examples later on, it will be more interactive and collaborative, right? So let's please bear with me for a while we discuss some key concepts before we move on to the actual scenario in the BPO industry. Now, first things first, we need to understand that the Data Privacy Act and the rules can trace its ancestry to the United Declaration of Human Rights, right? So, and even the NPC would say that the state policy to protect the human right of privacy is rooted to our in our constitution, and then of course we all know that our Bill of Rights basically, right, is more or less patterned after the United Declaration of Human Rights rather. And if you look at the statement of the Office of the High Commissioner of the United Nations Human Rights, the reason why they have that declaration is to prevent another Holocaust. And if you're familiar with history, is that we all know that the triggers of World War II which basically be the persecution of the Jews, the appetite of Nazis for more territory, right? And if you look at some investigation how the Nazis were able to persecute the Jews at the time and other non-Germans, is that they use data from their census, or they use census data, and through the use of census data, they were able to determine who are the Jews, who are those who are coming from less inferior races, so to speak. And they will identify the relatives, the family members, so on and so forth. So when they go house to house, they're equipped with information. They know how many members are in the household, right? For example, you have a Jewish family. They know the names, how many are the children, and so on and so forth. They use information, right, for discrimination purposes, and that is why that triggered the Holocaust. And from the words of the human rights activists, especially Europe, never again do they want to go into that situation. So that's why the privacy law in the Philippines, could trace its history or its lineage to that history of Europe, right? And that's why I said a while ago, their European counterparts have been doing privacy in and out, right, for the longest time. That's why it's really more of an evolution compared to us. It's really more of a revolution. Okay, next another set of key concepts. Later we'll be discussing about the processing of health data. So it's very important to understand what types of data are being collected. So if you're familiar, if you have underwent all these tests, rapid tests or swab tests, then you'll be familiar with the case investigation form. If you're an HR person, They'll be familiar with the contactless tracing form and the workplace sorry form. So collectively speaking, um, tons of data, no, tons of data being collected. So I took the opportunity to enumerate what are these data points, right? So everything's here: name, address, date of birth, age, sex, nationality, and so on and so forth. Even the fact that you died is also included in that data. Now, under the Data Privacy Act, you cannot just process health data. It's actually prohibited unless you have a legal basis for processing data. And I could enumerate three, which would be the most practical and appropriate under the situation. You have legal obligation, you have consent, and vital interests. No, definitely of all three, the most reliable would be legal obligation. And you have laws that will allow you to process sensitive personal information like health data. And these are, the mandatory reporting of these notifiable diseases. And of course, the Occupational Safety and Health Standards Act, right? And I would talk about this more later, but using consent is really problematic simply because, especially in the workplace environment, number one, consent has to be freely given, and consent can be withdrawn anytime, right? But more of that later. Next, of course, key concepts would be the what I would call the TLP principles. And you would see these principles in most of the advisories of the NPC when they tackle about how to process personal information. You have transparency, legitimate purpose, and proportionality. But under the law, it would be rearranged as legitimate purpose, proportionality, and transparency. But for me, as a memory aid, I use TLP, like let's kumbaga tender love for the Philippines. So that's my memory aid. So I'll never forget, right? TLP. Now, of course, transparency meaning if you're gonna process data of the data subject, the data subject should know the hows and whys of the processing, to whom you would be disclosing the data. Right? So in other words, there's no secret between you in the data subject as to how you're processing personal data. It's very important. Legitimate purpose, of course, when you process data, should not be for the purpose which is not contrary to the law, public morals, public policy, right? And lastly, proportionality. You can only be collecting data, right, on the minimum basis. You have to practice data minimalism, so to speak, right? So again, more of that later. Okay, and this is another set of concepts that would be very, very important. Again, you review the advisories of the NPC, and you will be probably encountering these terms, right? So if you process data, you collect, retain, definitely you have to have security measures in place. It will be technical security measures, organizational, and physical security measures. And you have examples here. In the context of a BPO, for example, what are our useful technical security measures? You have passwords, right? You have access cards. You have antivirus, firewalls. Organization security measures, we have a lot of policies that will be compliant with, let's say, credit card information or health information, and of course, the access control policies, right? So we have those policies in place. And physical security measures, again, in the context of a BPO, we have, if you go to any of our sites, you will see, of course, an army of security guards the moment you enter the premises. Of course, you have CCTVs left and right. So those would just be part of security measures. ID, you cannot enter the premises without an ID or even access card. Even before you enter the elevator, sometimes you will need to swipe your access card so that you'll be allowed to enter the elevator. Now, why do we need this? And this is also in the law. We need these measures in place to ensure there's CIA. If you're from the IT or info, you're part of info, you know this. You know the CIA triad. You have confidentiality of data, integrity of data, and availability of data. These are very, very important terms, and later on we'll again discuss that further. Okay, now what's the goal according to the NPC or according to the Data Privacy Act? Why do we need to implement security measures? To prevent disclosure and unlawful processing. And you will tie that up with confidentiality of data. And prevent alteration. Again, you will tie that up with integrity of data. And prevent accidental or unlawful destruction of data. You can tie that up, of course, with availability of data in accordance with the CIA triad. Next, of course, the threats are real. Why do you have this various security measures in place? Because the danger to the personal data, or of course, the confidential data of the company, of our company, and other BPOs, the threats are real. And what I have here are real examples. For example, hacking. There was this BPO in the Philippines who provided Delta Airlines with a chatbot. Now, the chatbot would allow more of an automated interface with the customers of Delta Airlines. Unfortunately, because of weak password management, somebody was able to hack the system. Somebody was able to get credentials, and they were able to manipulate that software that was installed in the website of Delta Airlines. For that reason, the hackers were able to monitor the information coming in and out of the website, thus compromising the personal information of the customers of Delta. Now, phishing. Last year, I saw this email. This email came to us. It was addressed to one of our executives. It's obviously a phishing email. Somebody pretending to be from the Michigan State, right, government, or yeah, Michigan State, saying that, hey, we will probably have a complaint. Click this link, you will see the complaint. Of course, our executive did not click the link, and they referred it, of course, to the data privacy team and InfoSec team for evaluation. Definitely, by looking at itself, it's really more a phishing email, right? So the problem with the phishing, definitely, and you must be aware of this. If you click this link, there must be opportunity to put ransomware in the system, right? So that will be affecting the availability of data. Okay, malicious insider. Of course, the profile will be somebody who's really had the intention of getting information from you and then selling it outside of the company. And this is not only common in the BPOs, there will be those also in any kind of industry. But let's have an example, right? A malicious side, a more concrete example. If you're aware of the data breach that happened affecting, I think it was Capital One, they put information in the cloud. They use Amazon Web Services. And unfortunately, there's this disgruntled Amazon Web Service employee. She discovered the misconfiguration, the firewall of Capital One, and she exploited that hole, and for which reason she was able to access the data of Capital One. Okay, human error. Well, recently I attended the Privacy Summit of the NPC, and this is the BPO Privacy Summit. It was mentioned by the NPC that the breach reports, the breaches reported to it from the BPOs would really be 64% of which would be due to human error, such as email mistakes. And I understand that even law firms would this would just happen with among the BPOs. It would happen in any industry. Even law firms. In fact, there's a Singaporean law firm. I think that happened last year. Somebody from the law firm emailed by mistake several people, and unfortunately, there were some personal data of their client contained in that email. Right? I don't think this is also common in the Philippines as well. Okay. So now that we've discuss the concepts, right? The TLP principles, the security measures, the the reason why we have the Privacy Act to begin with, and also the situation and how to in the pandemic, specifically the processing of sensitive personal data. Now, let's discuss the pandemic situation so far as the BPO industry is concerned. So we all know that on March 16 was the day one of the ECQ or the enhanced community quarantine. We all know establishments were ordered closed, except for certain industries that are considered essential and entities that were exempted. And among those exempted entities would be the BPOs. However, we were only allowed to have a skeletal workforce. Other employees would be required to work from home. So that resulted to a huge logistical nightmare for the BPO industry. Of course, definitely we're facing on how to continue business because our business really would be affecting various industries in the world, especially in the US. If we stop servicing those clients, then it will be hard. It will be hard for us to recover again. That's why we were able to convince the IETF to give us some leeway to allow us to operate, and then we also needed, of course, to transfer or transport or deploy rather equipment to our employees. Again, it's a logistical nightmare simply because we have more than 1 million employees involved, right? And that's why I don't know some of the if we have relatives from the BPO industry who are production agents, I'm sure they would have some war stories to tell because some agents would really literally have their desktop with them and their monitor right on their laps while they're being transported either by a shuttle or if they're lucky if they're able to get into a public use of public transportation. So it was really a logistical nightmare. And not only that, we are as data protection officers, we're also thinking already about the issues with respect to data security and privacy while we're doing those things, right? Okay, now at the present, we are now on a general community quarantine. Establishments are either partial or fully open, but although BPOs are supposedly fully operational, like any other industries in any other company, you're also required to maintain social distancing of this 1 meter to 2 meters. So in the context of the BPO, that would mean we can only put 50% of our workforce at our sites, and the rest would still be working from home. And that's a limitation, right, imposed by the current status we are in. Okay, for those who are working on site, then that created another set of concerns for us. If we a while ago I mentioned that the transporting and deploying equipment to the various households would will result to certain data security issues. For those who are working on site, has its own set of issues as well, or challenges. Definitely, we are required by law to ensure that we monitor our employees, right, in the workplace. We are required to have temperature checks and to require employees to accomplish survey forms. And then we are also subject to the contact trace activities of the Department of Health and LGUs. At the start of the pandemic, only the Department of Health, the LGUs, were involved in contact tracing. But later on, they delegated that obligation to employers as well. And that is why we're given this contact tracing forms from the LGUs, and we're required to submit that to the LGUs on a almost daily basis. Okay, and of course, this does not only a challenge among BPOs, this is a challenge in various establishments. Okay, if there's somebody in your community or workplace or establishment who is a close contact, suspect and confirm, then definitely you need to report that to the LGU, right? Okay, and then again, as I mentioned earlier, all these things involve sensitive personal information. Okay, so now we have a dilemma. So you have work from home employees and you have work on site employees. Now the challenges for work from home employees, of course, the data security from the perspective of the confidential information of the company, as well as the client formation, and of course privacy risks from the perspective of the employee. Now that, of course, if you talk about working on site, then you have issues on health risks. Why? Because if the LGU sees that your company would have quite a number of infections, then you will face closure. In fact, there already been several BPOs that have been shut down by the LGU because of infections at the workplace. And of course, it will also, when you process health data, would definitely be involved or be faced with challenges with respect to the privacy risk from the perspective of the employees. Again, because you're mainly processing the health data of your employees when you do contact tracing or reporting to the LGUs or even the Department of Health. Now, in this situation, there are employees like me, for example, I can work at the site, I can work at home. But there are employees who in BPOs who are either working from home because when you were recruited, your employment agreement says you will only be required to work from home. And then you have other agents, and these are the people who are in accounts that do not allow their accounts to be serviced outside of the premises. There are those accounts, and there are many of those, right? Especially those that deal with financial formation. Many of those would prohibit the servicing of their respective accounts outside of the premises. And for those types of employees, then definitely their activities are limited to the work site, meaning they can only perform work at the work site. So of course, definitely you'll be faced with the hybrid workplace, as that's what we have right now. And before, I noticed this in various business continuity plans I've reviewed in the past. You will be working from home if there's a disaster, etc., typhoon, storm. That's part of BCP plan. But now, since because of the privacy risks, data security, and health risks I mentioned, the BPOs would be embracing what we call a hybrid workplace. So it's no longer a business continuity concern, but now it has transformed itself to a business model, right? So definitely, the way we treat working from home is different moving forward. Now, just part now of a BPO's business model to have employees working from home versus employees working or limited or only allowed to work on site, especially for accounts that demand that their accounts be serviced on site. Okay, work from home challenges. So as I mentioned earlier, the data security is really a concern when your employees will be working from home. So imagine when you go back, I think we will be sharing the slides to you guys, those who attended this webinar. there are real threats outside, right, of the workplace, and that's why we have all these measures in place. So, for example, this is the workplace. Our employees will be here inside the workplace, right, for our measures to be effective. Now, because of the pandemic, those who usually be covered by security measures already outside, right, outside of the work area. So that's really a big headache for our InfoSec team, for data privacy teams. That's why when we're deploying all those equipment to our employees, we're also reviewing and revising our security policies to ensure that our security policies would cover work from home situations. And those are be part of the organizational measures. Now, technical measures, of course, you have these VPNs and multi-factor authentication as a recommended tool to ensure that the right person is accessing your data outside of the work environment. Or, of course, those who have access to your equipment, to your site, to your account, they should have the right access or authorized to access them. And you can do that through use VPNs and multi-factor authentication. Organizational measures, a while, as I mentioned earlier, we have to revise policies. Then, of course, example of that would be we have to revise them, right? Because the tendencies of employees, especially Filipinos, they're really into social media. So if you issue a computer, let's say to your agent, the person might be tempted to visit various social media sites. That's why, aside from having firewalls in place, definitely you also have to revise your policies to accommodate that kind of situation when even outside, most especially outside of the work area, not because the equipment is outside of the workplace doesn't follow that you can already use it for personal reasons. Doesn't follow, right? So that's why you have to be clear, or you have to revise the policy as an organizational measure. Physical measures, unlike in the workplace, you have CCTVs, you have guards. Now that you have when an agent would have our equipment, we cannot deploy a security guard, right, at the houses of our employees. So that's very impractical. And of course, we will not be able to require our agents to order IDs in the respective homes for obvious reasons. But anyway, there are physical measures, even physical measures, right? Even simple ones, right? Let's say, for example, like I mentioned here, in our policies, we will be asking the agents to reposition computer screens, prevent shoulder surfing. Right? So this means nobody except for the agent should be allowed to look at the computer screen. You can do it by simply repositioning the computer screens, right? Of course, you can have the to distribute locks, right? So they can lock the computer in place. There are types of there are many physical measures that can be done while in the while in the work from home environment. And some BPOs, what they did is that they also distributed panels, right? Like cubicles. So when you're inside your home, you can have some sort of limited privacy because you have this panels that would shield you and the monitor you're using from your relatives. So this really very peculiar because most BPOs are again not ready for this kind of scenario. In fact, they discourage production agents, or they would not allow production agents to be working from home for obvious reasons, like I mentioned a while ago, for data security reasons. But again, we need to adjust, right? We need to adapt the current situation. That's why we have to have different security measures that will be compliant still, but although in a different a different security environment. Okay, what to deploy? So this has been an issue, at least in our BPO at Alorica, there was a discussion. What do we deploy? Do we deploy desktops or do we deploy laptops? Of course, from a shore operations perspective, you want mobility. It will be easier to transport laptops than desktops. It is easier for you to be operational if you're using laptops rather than desktops because of the logistical nightmare involving, because unlike laptops, you have a computer monitor, right, and a PCU, a CPU. And then depends on the model of the desktop, then you have logistical issues. So who will transport that? Will it be the agent or will it be your facilities teams? So there'll be considerations in terms of mobility. Now, the problem with laptops, of course, inherent with any mobile equipment, a gadget, it can be easily stolen, right? So definitely, if that's the case, then many BPOs would rather would rather be deploying desktops instead of laptops. In our case, at least at the Lorica, we deployed mostly desktops to our production agents. Number three, and this is also a consideration in terms of having employees working from home. Telecommuting versus strictly working from home. There's a difference. Telecommuting means that you can be allowed to be in alternative workplaces. You could be the house, it could be the office, and definitely you're not prohibited from working in cafes, right? But for purposes of data security, at least for our company and some other BPOs, we have policy in place limiting the work should be done rather in the privacy of the house or the home. Why? Because if you're telecommuting, if you decide to work, let's say, in a cafe, and you might be tempted to use the public Wi-Fi. If you're an information security expert or an IT expert, definitely there will be red flags already, because of course, using public Wi-Fi's are not really safe. So you better remove the temptation from your employees or from the agents. That's why in our case, you would rather strictly have the work done at the house rather than allowing the employees to be telecommuting. So there be, of course, not all employees are have this kind of restriction. Me, for example, I can work anywhere because I'm not really, unlike our agents, we're really handling personal data of the client's customers. So it will be different at my end. But of course, I don't use public Wi-Fi, right? Just to put that out there. Okay, asset recovery. So with the million employees out there and more being recruited on a daily basis, there's a lot of attrition happening in the BPOs. We have a lot of employees either being terminated or simply resigning from their jobs. So definitely that will be another consideration. That's another challenge when you use the work from home model, the asset recovery. Well, most luckily, I suppose, for the BPO industry, our agents are not allowed to retain personal data um, in their equipment, right? In their computers. They only because number one, USBs are disabled. They're not allowed to. There are firewalls, right? They're whitelisting. You're using whitelisting, preventing them from taking out information or transferring them outside of the system. So there are those. So let's say a PC is lost. It will not be problematic because we know that that computer does not contain personal information. Of course, it's a different matter. Let's say if you're an employee is working with the payroll team, and he or she would have access probably to the various social security numbers of the employees, and if she would be saving that in the laptop, then that could be another issue altogether. But be that as it may, asset recovery is a challenge for those working, at least for those employers that have employees working from home, right? Because again, there'll be a issue if the equipment is stolen or lost or not returned. Definitely the part of the CIA triad might be affected. Could be confidentiality of data, right? That might be at stake there. Okay, asset integration. So for those employees that who return their equipment, and also in the event that we begin going back to the work site, uh, you will need to consider asset integration at the site. So meaning before you plug in that equipment into the system, make sure that the IT would check it first, right? Because you don't know, there might be a malware there, or it could possible also that the employee have shared the password to another person. That's why that's another tactic you need to do. You have to do a password reset as well. Okay, number six, and this is very, very important, right? You need to ensure that all your employees will be trained on data security. Now, it's a challenge simply because, we have to be virtual, right? That's why we have to embrace, again, digital transformation. We need to um, we need to have our training no longer face-to-face, but through micro-learning videos, and to be done virtually. Now, not only that, we also have to update our training modules on data security to again embrace the concept of working from, because of prior to the pandemic, our training materials with respect to data security only envisions data security inside the work area or on site. Then now that we're into when we shifted the workforce, most of the workforce to work from environment, definitely you have to revise your training materials as well. Security audits. Now, this is a challenge because before we conduct security audits face to face, or our auditors would do floor walks, right? But checking if the employee is observing clean desk policy, checking if the computer screen is locked, right? Checking if there'll be sharing of passwords, checking if there'll be paper and pen lying around. But you can't do that now because number one, it's a pandemic, which would limit the movement of employees. That's why you have to use teleconferences and web cameras to conduct this security audits, right? Like now we can do virtual audits by using a web camera. Okay, now productivity monitoring tools. So this really, really a problematic, or let's say a problem area for employers, not only among BPOs, but to all types of employers out there. There's this press release by the NPC saying that yes, you can have productivity monitoring tools in place for work from home employees. However, you should employ less privacy intrusive means of monitoring. In fact, they said here, the use of tracking mouse movements, recording keystrokes, taking random photos of the computer screen, and enabling webcams to take a picture of the employee might be considered as excessive and disproportionate, right? Um, I think for me, as a as a data protection officer, this we may need the NPC may need to revisit this one, right? In the light of data security issues. Maybe we can be talking about that later on. Now, what do other experts say about productivity monitoring tools? So there's this data privacy expert. Her name is Debbie Reynolds. So I would encourage everyone to check her out. She's on LinkedIn. She's a great resource. Want to learn more about data protection? I recommend Debbie Reynolds, also known as the data diva. And this is what she said about productivity monitoring tools. If the person isn't delivering as an employee, you will know. You don't have to track their eyeballs on the screen to know that. Now, okay, so that's what she said. That's how other experts from other jurisdictions would look at productivity monitoring tools. But then again, let's be clear, it is not prohibited uh, altogether. But what they're saying here is that there could be less intrusive ways to gauge the productivity of an employee. Now, regardless of what tool you will employ, you must conduct a privacy. I recommend that you conduct a privacy impact assessment. Okay, that will be the challenges related to working from home. And now let's talk about the other front, uh, health data processing challenges. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier at the start of my presentation, well, you need to make a decision. If you're going to process data, what will be your basis for processing data? Is it legal obligation? Is it consent? Or is it vital interest? Well, why does it matter? Why does it matter? If you look at the various contact tracing forms and health data survey forms that you will see, right? You go to a mall, you go to a restaurant, there is a provision at the end to be accomplished before you put your signature there. I hereby consent to the processing of data by the establishment in compliance with the mandatory reporting law, etc., etc., etc. Now, why is that problematic? Remember, as I mentioned earlier, consent can be withdrawn, right? Consent can be withdrawn at any time. For the employer as well, that's also it's really more problematic for the employer because in most survey forms I've seen so far in other BPOs, in other companies, they will still have that consent provision. If remember, you're doing contact tracing, then you may not need consent at all because you can rely on the legal obligation. Now, why is it material? Because remember, as I mentioned earlier, transparency. You have to disclose in your privacy notices statements the basis for your processing. Is it consent or is it legal obligation? But right now, it may not be a serious issue. But just to cite an example, in Europe, there's this audit firm which they have an employee, right, who said, no, I don't want you guys to, I withdraw my consent in the processing of my information. Regardless of the withdrawal of the consent, but still employee, okay? He's still employee of that auditing firm. Even if he withdrew the consent, the audit firm continued to process the data of that person. Now, the Data Protection Authority actually imposed a fine on that employer. Why? Because although the person withdrew the consent, yes, you may be allowed to process it, but you have to inform the employee on the basis for processing the data, because the basis processing date of the data is not included anymore in the privacy statement of that audit firm. Because earlier, the basis processing is consent. Now that has been withdrawn, what's your basis for processing now? All right. So that was the reason why that firm was fined by that European Data Protection Authority. Okay. 2, health surveys and contact tracing. Again, as mentioned earlier, you really need to master transparency, legitimate purpose, and proportionality principles. So why am I saying this? In terms of legitimate purpose, if you're an employer and your purpose is to perform contact tracing activities at the workplace, would you be collecting the data of the relatives of your employees that were exposed to that employee? Or would you just limit yourself to the collection of data of the employees and the employees around that person who were exposed to that person who later turned out to be a COVID infected person, right? So you see where I'm going here. So if your purpose is just that, then definitely you no longer have to, you're not allowed to collect data of the relatives, right? Because they're already out of scope of your purpose, which is to collect data and perform your duties as an agent of the LGU in terms of contact tracing, right, at the workplace. So in terms of proportionality, let's start with proportionality. Now, you perform in the contact tracing, when you fill up the contact tracing report, rather, you will, of course, include their data of the relatives of the employee because it's already excessive if you include that, right? And of course, transparency whenever, hopefully that you already revise your privacy notice or statements to reflect that you'll be collecting data of your employees for purposes of contact tracing. I hope you've done that already. It's really, really important. Okay, number 3, excessive data collection. Again, with the number of employees that we have, more than 1 million employees, and half of them probably reporting for work, and more than, or probably more than 500,000 are required to to uh, perform the survey. So then, if you be using paper, that would really be hard to manage. So again, we again shifted from paper surveys to digital health surveys, right? So of course, paperless would probably lessen also cases of infection. That's why, in our case, we moved at the very get-go. We moved from paper surveys to digital health surveys. However, we do this in-house. We didn't use a vendor for purpose of health service. If you look at the various establishments you go to in the mall, if you perform digital health survey, you would see that there's a third party that's actually processing that survey on behalf of the establishment. Because the more that you share the information, I think it's harder to contain and to control the personal information. It's already excessive already. Then definitely, if you start to share them to third parties, that might lead to a bigger headache, so to speak. Disposal retention. Um, I hope that you know this, that according to the workplace guidelines issued by both the Department of Trade and Industry and Department of Labor, can only retain health data for a period of 30 days. Okay? And this is probably the last challenge, right, in terms of health data processing of your employees or the workplace, discrimination. Um, I cited one of this. Of course, it's not really more of a workplace scenario, but I think it's very important for us to understand this case. I don't know if you've read this in the newspapers along. Probably this happened in May or March. There's this COVID-19 patient, and he was asked by the LGU, "Hey, can we disclose? We're having difficulties performing our contact tracing obligations. Is it okay with you if we identify you, make an announcement naming you that you have COVID, and then so we can improve our contact tracing abilities?" Of course, then the patient, okay, he said, okay, I'm okay with that, I'm fine with that. So in other words, the person gave his consent. Well, the night after he gave his consent, people started throwing rocks at their house. See, so why am I citing this example? Well, of course, and on its face, they have consent. you can the consent of the patient or the person is there, right? So you have basis for processing the employee's data. You have basis for disclosing. But then again, what I'm saying here, even if you have meeting all these requirements, people still be subject of discrimination, right? So you have to be very, very careful about your contact tracing activities. And now, for a more in another example, which affected one BPO company, what happened there is that in their company there was a high, not really a high level of infection, but there were some employees who were infected with COVID. So the BPOs performed their obligations. They report to the LGU and its health officer that they are the employees that were that can be classified as close contacts of this of the BP employees who were infected. So unfortunately, when this information, if the information was shared to the LGU, the unintended consequences there was that consequence there was that some of the employees were harassed by barangay officials. They were asked if they can go to their facilities for isolation. Or the BP employees said that they refused because why are you doing that? We're not close contacts, the people that you're saying that were infected by COVID. So these employees know they're not part of the contact tracing list. So they said, why are you trying to bring us to the isolation centers? And some of them also reported that, okay, so after the community learned that some of the employees in their workplace have COVID, and they've been identified to be an employee of that BPO, some of them were not allowed to board tricycles and jeeps because they were identified with that BPO company, which had a number of BPO infections. So those are really, let's say, probably unintended consequences of sharing data, especially to the contact tracing activities of employers. So they have to be careful of that one as well. Okay, so last slide. As I mentioned earlier, for the Philippines, privacy is really more of a revolution rather than an evolution. What's problematic, at least from my perspective, that we're still not used to that level of privacy maturity where we want to be. When we compare ourselves with our European counterparts, we have a long way to go. But when COVID-19 happened, then now we're not really used to the privacy of our own, not comfortable, we're not used to having a right of privacy, but we're now getting used to being the subject of surveillance for purposes of public health and data security, right? So getting used to that. The problem there, as one UN expert said, surveillance measures to curb the spread of COVID-19 could cause lasting damage to the right of privacy, which can be abused by authoritarian governments once the threat is over. So imagine that, going back to my example earlier, BPO employees, not even close contacts, were subjected to discrimination by government authorities. Unfortunately. So that's just probably a simple situation. But if we continue to be a subject surveillance, then it might be hard for us to go back to that pre-COVID stage that we have an appreciation of the right to privacy. And hopefully, after the pandemic is over, we can go back, right, to that stage that we can really be aware, familiar, and comfortable with our right to privacy. So with that said, I end this presentation.